Oh, oh God. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Gabesy here. This is the normal raid guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty. And feel free to check out any other guides on screen for any role-specific stuff, or just the mumble fight if you're into that. So let's get started. Now, for your raid composition, you'll want 1 or 2 tanks and 2 to 3 healers, standard stuff there. However, technically you can get by with 1 tank on this fight because the tank debuff only lasts 30 seconds, and there are phases that allow you to reset that debuff. That said, it's going to be a lot of damage on the tank, so you need to be able to handle that, but it is technically possible to 1 tank this. Now for healing, this is one of the most healing intensive fights in the zone on normal, so it's tough to say whether you should use 1 or 2 heals. It really depends on the strength of your healers and the DPS and gear of your raid in general. The overall goal is to be able to heal enough to stay in this first phase for a long enough period that you can do a decent amount of DPS. And we'll talk about the phases in a moment. But the other half of the fight, where you're in the frenzy phase, which you see here where you're kiting, things can not really be out-healed all that much. So the only limitation for the length of this phase is your ability to kite the boss. And therefore, extra healing in this phase doesn't really buy you any extra time. So again, you need to practice and just try 2 or 3 healers and see where your DPS is at. The DPS requirement for this encounter is quite severe in addition to the healing requirement. So again, you're going to have to do your best to experiment with 2 or 3 healers. We ended up using 2 healers, and it worked okay, but we are very overgeared for this content. And even then, the fight did not seem very easy compared to many of the other encounters. So anyway, you can 1 or 2 tank, and you can 2 or 3 heal. You will have to experiment and decide what works best for your group. So there are 2 phases in this fight, and you will begin and spend most of the fight in the first phase, which is the roar phase. So here you can see the boss is pulled, so he's tanked perpendicular to the raid, with the entire raid stacked up in melee range on his side. This is for efficient area of effect heals, with the current tank being the only player in front. No player should be behind because he also has a tail swipe attack. Now this phase essentially is a matter of prolonging it as long as possible. This phase will end when 5 or more players are below 50% health and within 10 yards of one another, at which point the boss will notice and he will start to go into a frenzy and chase players. And that begins the second phase. Now, every time the boss reaches 100 energy in this roar phase, he will use Deafening Screech, which does pretty massive damage to the entire raid, and it increases his energy regeneration each time as well. So he's gaining a stacking buff that's increasing his regen, and at some point, the number of roars simply outpaces your ability to heal players up above 50% before the next one hits, because basically 2 roars in a row will drop everyone except maybe a tank below 50% no matter what. So you have to basically land heals between those periods. And since the roars come more and more frequently as the phase goes on, eventually this just becomes uncontrollable. But that said, the goal again is to prolong this phase, especially the first time you're in this phase, as long as you can. You want to prolong all the other ones as well, but this one in particular, because there's nothing else going on, is your best bet to spend as much time here as you can and do as much DPS as possible. The other important thing is that the Deafening Screech interrupts spell casts. So pretty much anything that's channeled or cast, when it goes off, it will interrupt. And that means it's quite annoying actually for certain healers, as well as for, caster DPS types. So this is one of those rare situations where melee DPS actually are stronger than ranged in this phase in particular. Now in the other phase, ranged then take the lead because melee can't attack the boss. But that's just one of those things to keep in mind. So a good balance of DPS is probably ideal for this fight. The frenzy phase is triggered when 5 or more players reach 50% health or below, And as soon as this starts, the boss will fixate on a random raid member and begin chasing them. Now, tanks seem to be the only targets that are not valid for this fixate. During this period, a jailer will spawn from the entrance of the room and should be tanked and killed by raid members. Upon killing it, it will drop a prison key that can be used to unlock one of the 3 cages around the room. You kind of can see the green raid marker near the boss there is one of the cages. There's one to the left there where the blue marker is, and then there's one in the back of the room as well where the red is. So, upon opening these cages, the boss will notice that the prisoner has been freed after a moment, and instead of fixating on another raid member, it will fixate on the released prisoner, go over and eat them, gaining a buff of some sort that makes the fight more difficult from then on, but ending that phase. And then your raid can stack up, and you're back into the roar phase from there on. So that said, dealing with the frenzy phase is basically a matter of positioning, kiting effectively, and killing the jailer and opening the proper prison cell when it's time. So because anyone is a valid fixate target, and you can be a valid fixate target multiple times in a row, so back to back, it's important that you kite the boss properly. And this can be somewhat tricky because every time he fixates on a new target, or not even then actually, just throughout the phase, he will gain stacks of blood frenzy, which increase his movement speed. In addition to that, anybody that's caught in front of the boss during this phase will be instantly killed. He'll just chomp their face off pretty much. So the way that we sort of handle this is once the phase begins, everyone sort of runs toward the middle. And that way, if you happen to be fixated, you can just keep running the boss in that direction to the back of the room, away from the rest of the raid who's toward the front, dealing with the jailer and whatnot. So here you can see is a double fixate that I was talking about. And early on, these aren't very dangerous because the boss is not moving fast enough. So I'm able to buy myself enough time and stay away far enough that he won't kill me. But later in the phase, when he's faster, a double fixate is pretty much a death sentence unless you have a ton of movement boosts or teleports, that kind of stuff. So it's important to your raid to decide how many fixates you feel comfortable handling in this phase before you open the jail cell and transition him back out. For us, without Warlock portals and only a few raid-wide movement abilities, we decided to activate the prison cage or open it on the 3rd fixate. So essentially, on the start of the 3rd fixate on a random raid member, the tank that was tanking the jailer and had picked up the key from the jailer's body opens the next cage that whatever we've decided is next. And it takes about another fixate round or so in time for the boss to actually notice in the script to pick up that there's a prisoner out and for the boss to go over there. So basically plan to open it about 1 fixate earlier than you can safely handle. And once you figure that method out, then it should work every time as long as players properly run, in the opposite direction of where the dinosaur's at the time. So the issue becomes later in the fight when there are dots and other damage sources going out during this phase and the raid is spread out. So another thing we found that somewhat helped, although it was difficult to do with just 2 healers, was to sort of split healing assignments by positions around the room so that at least when some player is kiting, if they have a big dot or something, there's a healer somewhat close to them that can give them a few heals if needed. But the worst case scenario is a player that is kiting far from the raid simply has to use a personal cooldown to mitigate the damage that's going on. So here you can see I'm trying to get over to heal our hunter, but the room is so massive that it's really difficult to do and probably not even worthwhile. The final thing to mention is that we'll talk about the order of cages in a moment, but essentially during this phase, because you cannot get in front of the dinosaur, melee pretty much cannot attack the dragon during this period. It's just too risky to do so. The dinosaur, I keep doing that. You can't attack the dragon either, because there isn't one, but you shouldn't attack the dinosaur, mostly. So this means that ranged are pretty much delegated to DPSing on Thok during this phase, because they can stay pretty far away and still do some damage. Meanwhile, your melee DPS should focus on killing the jailer, with the tank that is tanking them near the entrance. And this way the raid is safely out of the line that Thok will run. And once he fixates on someone from the back here that he's about to do, that player can simply run to the sides, or they can go back toward the entrance of the room if the rest of the raid gets out of the way. It's really up to your raid. And again, things like warlock portals or personal teleports make this quite a bit easier, as well as raid sprints, personal sprints, things like that. You could go for another fixate or two, perhaps, if you had those mechanics to rely on and, delay this phase longer. That would give you more DPS on the boss that you don't have to do in the normal roar phase. So there are 3 prisoners around the room, each locked up in a different cage. And releasing a prisoner, as mentioned, will cause Thok to consume that prisoner during his fixate phase, and in the phase going back to the roar phase. However, he will also gain a debuff of some sort that increases his damage output in some way from the prisoner, and this will last until he consumes another prisoner and replaces the previous debuff. So it is somewhat up to the raid to decide which of these they want to do and in which order. But in addition to providing a debuff to the boss, the NPCs also try to help you a little bit before they're consumed. Now, the value of this assistance varies greatly depending on the NPC. So we'll just kind of briefly go through both their buffs and their debuffs that each prisoner provides. So the first prisoner is Water Speaker Garai, and he's in the west cage, which is the blue raid marker, if you see that at some point in the video here. When he is released, he will cast a heal on the entire raid that does about 50,000 healing per second for 10 seconds, called Restorative Waters. Basically, it's almost worthless. It will top players off just as the phase is ending, which is nice, I guess. But for the most part, it's kind of a very useless buff overall. So it won't give you a lot. His ability that he gives to Thok is Infusion of Frost, which gives him a freezing breath attack. It does moderate damage to the tank, but more importantly, it will give a stacking debuff. And at 5 stacks, the tank becomes frozen in a tomb of ice. So, especially if you're using a 1-tank method, this is going to be very difficult to do Water Speaker Garai first or even second, because the tank will quickly become frozen in that setup. The other thing will be Icy Blood, which is cast on random raid members, and this applies moderate damage up front, as well as a 15-second dot that does low damage per second. But just like the tank ability, if it reaches 5 stacks, the player will be frozen in a tomb of ice for a while. So that's Water Speaker Garai. The next prisoner is Akolik, and he is in the cage to the north, which is the green raid marker. So this guy will cast a Holy Order of Cross, which I could not figure out what it does in terms of benefit to the raid. So if anyone knows, feel free to comment, because it seems like it doesn't do anything. But essentially, he has a poison infusion that he'll add to the boss. So again, there's an acid breath. This does very heavy damage in front of the boss, and it reduces the armor by 20% of the tank. So again, another reason for tank swaps, although this one is technically survivable with 1 tank. He also uses Corrosive Blood, which is cast on random raid members. It does moderate damage up front, and then it's a long dot that does 40,000 damage every second for 30 seconds. This also stacks, but it is dispellable with magic dispels. So if you're using 2 healers, even if you dispel as quickly as possible, often you won't be able to get rid of them all because it likes to apply frequently. But if you're using 3 healers, you should be able to dispel just about as fast as they're cast. Mass dispel and things like that will be very helpful here, especially as you're about to enter the next phase. So as he begins his fixate, if you can throw down a mass dispel, get rid of all those stacks, that'll help you out a fair bit. And then finally, the third cage is War Master Montak, and he's in the south cage, which is the red raid marker for us. He's the fire guy. So when he is freed, he actually provides the most benefit to the raid, but in my opinion, is also the most difficult in terms of ability to deal with. So he will give everyone in the raid a buff called Flame Coating, which lasts for a minute, and it basically gives them a 75% chance on attacking, dealing damage, to do about 100,000 or a little more damage, depending on your gear, to the boss, or whatever you're attacking. So this lasts a minute, so it's actually a sizable DPS increase across the entire raid. However, to counteract this, his infusion abilities are quite damaging. Again, he gives a buff, or a breath to the boss, called Scorching Breath. Does moderate damage, but it applies a stacking dot to the tanks. So again, tank swaps probably are key here. But the raid ability, called Burning Blood, is by far the most difficult to deal with. You can see on the screen there. He will cast oil patches and burn them on fire under random players, which deals pretty heavy damage in that location. Because of that, this is the only prisoner release time that you cannot stack like you would in the other normal phases, because you'll just have puddles under you and you'll quickly die to it. So this means that for this period, you have to stay spread out. And then to end the phase, since the phase only ends when 5 or more players are stacked close to one another and below 50%, it means you have to find a way to stack up when it's time to phase, not push it too long before it's too late, but also keep everyone below that 50% mark. So it's a kind of troublesome phase transition, essentially. You want to get people below 50%, but then keep them there and then have them stack without standing in fire and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, keep that in mind and balance accordingly. Technically, if you do War Master first, because of the 1 minute buff, that will give you the most DPS to push the fight. But on the other hand, you won't be able to stay in the first phase as long. So that sort of counteracts that DPS gain from the buff that it gives you. So in our case, we did the War Master last because, again, we're pretty well geared. So we could kind of not have to spend very much time in that phase and instead just rely on our gear and our ability to stay in the normal phases longer in the first 2 periods so that we can. So I think that pretty much covers everything for Thok the Bloodthirsty's normal raid guide. This is mechanically a pretty simple fight. It's mostly a DPS healing, kind of gear check fight. You can extend the fixate phase, as mentioned, with excellent kiting tactics, portals, all that good stuff. But for the most part, it's just going to be a matter of staying in the normal phase as long as you can to meet the DPS requirement. So, good luck, and thanks for watching.